Today, the dominance of the aircraft carrier across every ocean in every theater of the Second World War feels like a foregone conclusion. But in the late 1930s, that conclusion had not yet been reached. The dominant figure on the naval stage was still the battleship. Steel fortresses displacing tens of thousands of tons, their guns throwing shells of 343, 356, 380, 406 millimeters. The carrier school and the battleship school argued bitterly, and neither had yet won the argument. Then the war came, and the argument began to be settled in blood. On June 8, 1940, somewhere in the Norwegian Sea, an aircraft carrier and two battleships found each other. What followed was one of the most lopsided and most heroic surface engagements of the entire war. And it began, as so many disasters do, with a string of small decisions that each seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. To understand what HMS Glorious sailed into that evening, we need to go back. Not to 1940, further. Back to the end of the First World War, and to what the peace that followed actually meant for Germany. The Versailles Conference of 1919 imposed punishing terms on the defeated nation, and the German fleet bore the full weight of them. Almost every significant warship was liquidated. What Germany was permitted to keep was a handful of obsolete pre-dreadnoughts, hurried out of reserve so the country would have at least the semblance of a coastal defense force. New construction was forbidden for 20 years. Those old ships, however, were so antiquated that their allotted 20 years ran out almost immediately. And even before the Weimar Republic gave way to the Third Reich, German naval architects, drawing on one of the finest engineering traditions in the world, had begun developing something new. The constraint was severe: no ship over 10,000 tons. Within that envelope, Germany produced the Deutschland class, officially called Panzerschiffe, or armored ships, a deliberately vague designation chosen so that the Allies wouldn't immediately recognize what they were looking at. The British press, less charitable, called them pocket battleships. Their diesel engines gave them extraordinary range that would not be matched until nuclear propulsion arrived, and their acceleration outstripped anything with a steam turbine plant. Their 283mm guns were accurate and well-served, but they were small. And at sea, size has consequences. France had been excluded from the Washington Naval Conference of 1922 and had not anticipated what Germany was building or who it was being built to fight. The Deutschland class had been conceived with France as the likely adversary. When Paris realized this, it had to respond. The result was the Dunkirk class. Fast, well-armed battleships with 330mm guns, designed specifically to outclass anything Germany had produced or planned. They succeeded. A Deutschland-class ship, meeting a Dunkirk alone, almost certainly could not have won. Grand Admiral Raeder's answer was to demand something bigger. At first, an enlarged Deutschland with more displacement, heavier guns, better armor. Then the decision was made to abandon the incremental approach entirely. Germany would build a real capital ship. What emerged from the drafting tables was the Scharnhorst class. Full displacement around 38,000 tons, nearly 3 times the Deutschland ships. The main armament kept the same 283mm caliber, which has led some to underestimate these weapons. That would be a mistake. The guns were entirely redesigned: longer barrels, heavier shells with better aerodynamics, and a maximum range of 42 kilometers. No heavy naval gun of the period could match that. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau could, in theory, engage almost any adversary afloat and dictate the terms of the fight from beyond the enemy's effective reach. 9 guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 superfiring forward, 1 aft, backed by heavy secondary batteries and extensive anti-aircraft armament. The armor was serious. 350mm main belt, 360mm on the main turrets, a layered armored deck, and a 45mm internal strake behind the belt. When these ships are called battle cruisers, as they sometimes are, the label doesn't quite fit. Their protection is simply too substantial for the category. Construction was not trouble-free. The diesel engines of the Deutschland class were abandoned for steam turbines. Sea trials revealed that in any kind of sea, the bow drenched everything forward of the bridge, making it nearly impossible to fight the forward guns. The solution was a redesigned stem, the Atlantic bow, a high, flared profile that climbed over the waves rather than punching through them, and which became perhaps the most distinctive visual feature of both ships. Scharnhorst was launched in October 1936, Gneisenau in December of the same year. They commissioned in 1939 and 1938, respectively, which is why some call the class after Gneisenau, since she entered service first. Convention, however, names classes after the lead ship, and that is the usage here. These ships had been built to fight France. The war, when it came, had other ideas. The story of Glorious begins not with her career as a carrier, but with what she was before. And that story begins in 1909, in the restless imagination of Admiral Sir John Fisher, First Sea Lord. Fisher had already changed the Royal Navy once, with the dreadnought and the battle cruiser. Now he had a new idea. The coming war, whose outlines were already becoming visible, would require operations in the Baltic, supporting Russian forces, threatening Germany's exposed northern flank. But the Baltic had shallow waters and narrow approaches, and the Navy's heaviest ships couldn't operate there freely. Fisher wanted something different, something large and powerful enough to dominate whatever Germany could send, but fast enough and shallow-drafted enough to work in confined waters. The result was the light battle cruiser, an ungainly name for an ungainly concept. Ships nearly 240 meters long, armed with 380mm guns, but with minimal armor and very shallow draft, trading protection for a speed of over 31 knots. 3 were built: HMS Courageous, HMS Glorious, and HMS Furious. The Baltic Plan never came to anything. Russian and British forces operated largely independently. The strategic situation shifted, and the light battlecruisers found themselves without a role. They were expensive, lightly protected, and widely considered a mistake. Then came the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. Among its provisions was a clause permitting conversion of existing capital ship hulls into aircraft carriers. The Royal Navy surveyed its large, fast, nearly purposeless light battle cruisers and saw an opportunity. Glorious was rebuilt as a carrier. The main armament came out. The torpedo tubes eventually followed, and in their place came a full-length flight deck, 2 hangar levels, aircraft elevators, and accommodation for an air group of up to 48 aircraft. 16 120mm dual-purpose mounts provided anti-aircraft defense. From her battlecruiser days, Glorious kept 2 things: speed and a degree of structural protection, though the armor was light, as it had always been. What she became was an unusual machine, large, fast, capable, and more vulnerable than her size suggested. The phony war ended in the spring of 1940. Germany struck Denmark and Norway simultaneously in a combined operation of Army, Navy, and Air Force. Denmark fell in a day. Norway was harder. Allied forces landed in Norway, and at Narvik in the far north, actually surrounded the German garrison. For a time, that garrison, cut off, outfought, and running short of options, faced the prospect of being forced into neutral Sweden and interned for the rest of the war. The pressure from land and sea was sustained and real. Aircraft carriers were central to the campaign. Glorious, Furious, and Ark Royal ferried land-based aircraft to Norwegian airfields and used their own squadrons to support Allied ground forces. Among the most valuable aircraft involved were the new Hawker Hurricanes, modern, capable fighters that Britain could not easily afford to lose. Then France collapsed. The scale of the catastrophe on the Western Front made everything else secondary. With the British Expeditionary Force falling back toward Dunkirk and the possibility of a German invasion of Britain suddenly real, the Allied forces in Norway had to be withdrawn. Operation Alphabet, the evacuation from Narvik, began in early June. Glorious had a particular value in this operation. Her aircraft elevators were large enough to accept hurricanes with wings spread, something standard carrier elevators could not accommodate. She took the fighters aboard and prepared to sail for home. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Wilhelm Marschall had received his orders. He was to take his ships to sea and intercept the Allied convoys withdrawing from Norway. Marschall was a capable and experienced officer, a man who had served on minesweepers, capital ships, and submarines before reaching flag rank. He was not on easy terms with Grand Admiral Raeder. The two men disagreed on matters of tactics and strategy, and the friction between them was well known. His orders, however, were clear. Find and sink troop transports. Engaging Allied warships was a secondary objective, incidental to the main task, not the point of the operation. On June 7, 1940, something unexpected happened within the Allied formation. HMS Glorious detached from the main group. The force she left behind was substantial: 2 carriers, cruisers, a destroyer screen. What Glorious took with her were 2 escorts. The destroyers HMS Acasta and HMS Ardent. Both were A-class vessels, built in the late 1920s. Capable ships, but not new, and there were only 2 of them. Why Glorious left the main force has never been fully established. The official explanation is fuel. She had burned through her reserves during the evacuation and needed to reach Scapa Flow urgently to refuel. It is a plausible reason. There is another account, never officially confirmed but taken seriously by naval historians, which points to something more personal. Rear Admiral Guy d'Oyley Hughes, the flag officer embarked in Glorious, had reportedly come into sharp conflict with the ship's captain over questions of authority and command. D'Oyley Hughes was not a man who kept his opinions to himself. He had begun his career as a submariner, and a decorated one. During the Dardanelles campaign, he had gone over the side of his own submarine under fire, swum ashore with explosives, and personally blown up a section of the Baghdad-Constantinople railway. He had then, in later years, taught himself to fly, an unusual step for a senior officer, because he understood that the aircraft were the carrier's primary weapon, and he intended to understand them. The conflict with his captain, by some accounts, had become serious enough to require a formal inquiry. The rush back to Scapa Flow, in this version, was as much about reaching a court of law as about reaching a fuel depot. Whatever the reason, Glorious was sailing alone, or nearly so, through waters that were considered secure. The Royal Navy's strength in these waters was overwhelming. The Kriegsmarine, for all its ambition, was a fraction of the size of the force that had faced it at Jutland in 1916. And even there, the Germans had been fortunate to escape. There was no particular reason to expect enemy capital ships in the Norwegian Sea. Nobody knew Marshall was there. At 1646 on June 8th, a lookout on Scharnhorst reported smoke on the horizon, to the east of the German squadron. The German radar sets, among the best available in 1940, could measure range but could not identify what they were looking at. Marshall altered course and increased speed to investigate. At 1700, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst ran up their battle ensigns. They turned east and drove toward the smoke, working up to nearly 31 knots. 160,000 shaft horsepower, pushing 38,000 tons of ship through the evening sea. Aboard Glorious, the approaching vessels were assumed to be friendly. She was making 17 to 18 knots on an anti-submarine zigzag, the only threat that seemed worth worrying about. She had 5 Swordfish torpedo bombers embarked, the rest of her hangar capacity occupied by the evacuated Hurricanes. 2 of the Swordfish had been brought up to the flight deck as a precaution. It was a precaution taken too late. At 1720, the identity of the approaching ships became unmistakable. Battle stations. At 1727, Gneisenau opened fire. Range, approximately 25 kilometers. German gunnery in 1940 was among the finest in the world, and it showed. A standard bracketing sequence, first salvo short, second over, and then, 5 minutes after the first shot, at a range most navies would have considered the outer edge of practical accuracy. A shell from the 3rd or 4th salvo struck Glorious's flight deck. It penetrated. It detonated below the surface. The structural damage was severe, and the Swordfish on deck were destroyed where they stood. The flight deck was wrecked. Glorious could no longer fly off aircraft, could no longer recover them. In a single hit, the most dangerous weapon on the most dangerous ship in any surface engagement, her aircraft, had been taken from her permanently. She was now a large, fast ship with no way to fight back. 2 destroyers, each less than 100 meters long, turned toward 2 battleships and attacked. Acosta and Ardent laid smoke between Glorious and the Germans, and then drove into that smoke and out the other side, heading directly for the enemy. Their torpedoes were effective weapons, but they required the ships to close the range, to come within reach of guns that could tear a destroyer apart. They came anyway. The first torpedo runs were pressed hard, but made from too great a distance. The Germans maneuvered, and the weapons passed wide. The destroyers fell back into their smoke screens, reformed, and attacked again. Meanwhile, Glorious was trying to use her speed, still considerable, even loaded, to open the range and buy time until darkness. She almost had the legs for it. But the 30 minutes lost before battle stations had been called could not be recovered, and the geometry was against her. A shell struck the island superstructure and killed every senior officer on the bridge. The captain was among them. Command passed to a junior officer, Lieutenant Commander Lovell, who continued to fight the ship. Ardent was hit by secondary battery fire at 1822 and went down. Acosta continued alone. Without a second ship to maintain the smokescreen, Glorious was periodically exposed, and each time she was, the German guns found her. A further hit struck her machinery spaces and jammed her rudders. She fell into an uncontrolled turn, unable to steer, unable to accelerate, unable to maneuver. The range was closing now, and she could do nothing about it. Commander Charles Glassford of Acosta knew what was happening. Glorious was beyond saving. That was clear to anyone who could see. Glassford had options. He could have laid smoke, turned west, and run. He had a reasonable chance of making it. His crew had a reasonable chance of making it. He made a different choice. he gathered his men. What he said to them has been reported in different ways by the few survivors, but the substance was consistent. He told them he was proud to have served with them. And then Acosta turned toward the enemy one last time. She closed to short range and put a single torpedo into Scharnhorst's stern. The hit opened a hole roughly 3 meters across in the hull. One turbine was wrecked. One secondary battery mounting was put out of action. One main gun turret was disabled. Scharnhorst took on water rapidly, developed a pronounced stern trim, and lost a significant portion of her speed. She would spend months in dry dock. Acosta continued firing her 120mm guns, scoring at least one more hit, until the weight of fire directed at her became impossible to survive. She sank at 1908. The Germans did not stop to rescue survivors. Scharnhorst's damage was severe enough to require immediate attention, and Marshall's ships cleared the area at speed. Distress signals from Glorious had been received by HMS Devonshire, the cruiser that had, only days earlier, evacuated the Norwegian royal family. But her own situation made a full rescue impossible. Between 40 and 46 men were pulled from the sea. Approximately 1,515 were not. The loss of Glorious was a severe blow. In a single engagement, the Royal Navy had lost a carrier, 2 destroyers, and over 1,500 men, more in a single afternoon than the German army had lost in the entire Norwegian campaign. But the sacrifice of Acosta had a direct and measurable consequence. By the time Scharnhorst was repaired and Marshall's ships were able to return to sea, the convoys from Narvik had completed their withdrawal. The men were home. Some of the hurricanes were home. The window had closed. As for the debate between the battleship school and the carrier school, Glorious's loss put the first mark on the board in favor of armor and guns. It would not be the last word on the subject. The years that followed would demonstrate at enormous cost and in every ocean that the balance of naval power had shifted in ways that no amount of steel plate could reverse. But that is a later chapter, and it belongs to other ships and other sailors.